When Ilya and Tanya first started dating, the man found out that Tanya was running to another guy for a date. Then he had a serious talk with him and Tanya offered to choose between him or Ilya. The choice was obvious. Ilya was the son of businessman. He worked at his father's company and made good money. Of course, between the poor student and Ilya, she chose the latter. Ilya was head over heels in love with his wife. He liked everything about her. The way she looked, the way she talked, the way she moved. She was 24 and he was 30 when they got married. Ilya did not skimp on the wedding. Tanya could choose anything she liked. The celebration turned out to be lavish in scope, and after it the young couple went on vacation. Ilya did not insist that Tanya work, they had enough money. The man tried to give his wife more time, took her on vacations, invited her along with him to events. He was proud of his wife. He was very flattered to show her off to everyone. Tanya was always smartly dressed and aroused the interest of men and the envy of women. After a while, her husband began to notice that his wife often went somewhere. She said she was going to the gym, to her friends, to a beauty salon. She always had some excuse to leave, and when she came back, Tanya was always in a good mood. "You look different." Smiling, Ilya looked at his wife, who had just returned from another treatment at the salon. "I'm just trying to be better for you," Tanya purred in his ear. Ilya held his wife tightly against him and inhaled her scent. Tanya's hair smelled faintly of cigarette smoke and men's cologne. "And why do you smell of men's perfume?" Tanya strictly asked. "Ilya, are you up to your old tricks again?" Tanya's cheeks flared. She pushed her husband away from her and indignantly exclaimed, "How can you suspect me? I do everything for you and you." Turning around, Tanya cried and went to her room. A feeling of guilt came over Ilya. He immediately began to look for reasons to justify Tanya, because deep in his heart he was afraid of repeating that situation with another man. They never brought it up again and Ilya tried to make amends with his wife. Now it seemed to him that he had wrongly accused her, and his conscience was eating him up from the inside. One evening Ilya got a call from a friend and asked him to meet him. He agreed. They went to a restaurant where Ilya had too much alcohol. Sitting at the table with his hand under his head, Ilya with a slurred tongue poured out to his friend about Tanya, about her cheating before the wedding and about the fact that recently Ilya had smelled someone else's scent on her again. "Ilya, my friend, was also pretty drunk, you fool. She was pulling the strings out of you and you were happy to try." They had never talked like that before, but in the morning, the memories of that evening left Ilya with only vague images and a headache. But the strangeness from his wife did not end there. After a while, the man began to notice traces of bruises on his wife. When he asked Hania about it, she said they were left by the monsieur. Ilya believed her. Indeed, his wife had just had a massage. But later bruises began to appear not only on her thighs, and one day Ilya noticed a blue spot on her neck. He was very angry at Tatiana, but he couldn't do anything about it. She had not been caught by the hand, which meant that Ilya had no proof, but the whole situation moved forward. One night, when the lift got a call from his friend and asked for an urgent meeting, Jaeger was very nervous. He, greatly embarrassed, began his story. Stammering, his friend quietly confessed that he had very unusual interests in bed. Ilya immediately laughed. "Of course, I'm happy for you that you dare to open up like this. But tell me, what do your interests have to do with me?" The most direct Jaeger snapped back. His friend asked him to listen carefully as his friend looked very serious. Ilya was silent. His friend told him that there was a hobby club in their city. Grown-ups and completely different people met there once or twice a week. And yesterday, when Jaeger was at another meeting, he saw a vaguely familiar woman. At first he did not pay any attention to it. It was a small town. Some faces stuck out in his memory, and then he realized who it was. "Ilya, do you know anything about your wife's affairs?" Igor asked cautiously. The man was embarrassed but answered that he had suspicions about Tanya. But then, finding no evidence, it all went away. "And why do you ask globally?" asked Ilya. "Because yesterday in this club was not only me. The woman who seemed to me familiar turned out to be Tanya," concluded the friend. Ilya was dumbfounded. Now he began to understand what Igor was getting at and what the whole story was about. The puzzle in the man's head was complete. All the thoughts that were swirling in his head were true. A friend told him what kind of club it was. People who had certain interest in bed gathered there. Now it occurred to Ilya how his wife got the bruises. Of course, the story about the massage seemed true to him, but now he understood that it was all a lie. He asked Jaeger where the club was and asked him to take him there. He spent the whole week on pins and needles that very day. Ilya waited a long time for his wife to finish packing and leave the house, and when he did, he went after her. He was given a mask at the club so no one would recognize him. Anonymity was the club's rules. Ilya began to wait to be introduced to his wife. He was very nervous while waiting. Jaeger whispered in his ear how the meeting at the club was going. The girls come out one by one and everyone chooses a partner. Then we go to their rooms. Ilya was so tense he even wanted to leave, but his friend stopped him, saying that lies could not last forever. There were only men sitting in the waiting room. They were all wearing masks and stripped down to their underwear. Some had a leather harness on their bodies. Finally they heard the door to the room open for Ilya. A pounding in his temples. Is adrenaline going off the scale to the last? He didn't want to believe he was about to see his wife. The women came out one by one. They were all dressed in identical mesh dresses. Each one had a mask on her face, but unlike the men's, it only covered the top part of their faces. In addition to the mask, a ribbon covered their eyes. The women could not see who was choosing them. The first girl came out. The Leo relaxed a little. It wasn't Tanya. The second went on the third, and then finally he saw his wife. There was no doubt that it was her. When you live with a man for many years, you know his every move and every point on his body. The women lined up opposite the men. Ilya was about to rush to her, but Jaeger stopped him. Don't spoil the other's evening, he said. Take her into the room and talk to her. Ilya stepped forward first. He was afraid that Tanya would be intersected by someone else. He held out his hand to his wife and led her into the room. There he first removed the mask from himself and from Tanya. The woman's eyes adjusted to the light and she saw Ilya in front of her. So tell me, has it started again? Asked and exhausted. Ilya, what do you miss? I don't understand. You're all running around for men. Tanya looked at him defiantly. Her face showed that she did not have the slightest bit of regret. I want to and I will, and you won't do anything to me. So many years you have put up with it, and you will put up with it again. You humiliated me in front of my friend. Ilya touched her shoulders. I will not stand for this. He tossed her a couple of dirty curses. Ilya left the room. Tanya shouted after him that she hated him. The man knew that he had allowed all this to happen himself, that he had originally got involved in this case, knowing the whole truth about Tanya, but always believed that family life would change her. But apparently there are some people for whom a quiet family life is simply contradicted. The spouse is divorced. Finally, the man told about the strange hobbies of Tanya to her parents. First, so they would not tire him with questions about the reasons for divorce, and secondly, so that her parents would somehow control their daughter and prevent her from completely sliding down the social ladder. Their town isn't the biggest, and rumors could easily spread. But the woman was not affected by her parents' entreaties to come to her senses. She was an adult and she could decide for herself what to do. As a result, not only her close friends but also her relatives turned away from her. That was the reason she did not tell anyone about her preferences. Relatives would consider it shameful. And so it turned out the ex-wife was still mad at Ilya for a long time for telling her parents and friends everything. But there was nothing she could do about it. The man felt cheated and Tanya made her choice. And every such choice always has consequences. The next story is even more interesting. Watch it all the way to the end, you will definitely be surprised. Vesel and Olga were married not long ago. Although their relationship had already lasted 7 years. They were both in their 30s, they were both adults and self-sufficient, and it couldn't have been happier. They approached their marriage responsibly, without rushing headlong into it. They moved in together only after they got their passports stamped. Her grandmother left her apartment to Olya, and this was a real blessing for the young family. Each of the spouses had their own interests, their own activities. They always said they were modern enough not to follow each other, but only to follow themselves. Their favorite pastime was to have dinner together, watch some soap opera, and then drink tea in the kitchen by candlelight. That night, they also sat together after work, singing a second pot of tea for two. Imagine Moshka and hers are getting a divorce without taking her eyes off the phone, said her husband, Olga. Vasily was surprised. Maria and her husband seemed such a beautiful couple. What happened? He asked. In response, Grishka decided to return to his first love. It turns out that for half a year, he'd been making love to Masha behind her back. Olga talked about it easily and at ease, as if adultery were an everyday occurrence and there was no need to pay attention to it. Vasily looked suspiciously at his wife. And you would forgive me for treason? He asked a provocative question. Wife still did not take your eyes off the screen, replied question by question. Do you plan to cheat? No, abruptly he said. And I won't forgive you for it. Yes, it hurts. Olga lazily answered. Olga Vasia did not want to develop the subject further. The tone of the conversation he categorically did not like. He just shrugged and left the kitchen. For some reason, this seemingly insignificant conversation settled in the man's mind, and he periodically went over it in his thoughts. Never before had he even considered the possibility of cheating, not his wife, much less his own. And if Fazio was 100% sure of himself, then to get inside Olia's head and see what she thought about it, the man could not, and it clearly bothered him. Vasily decided to share his thoughts with his friend, but he did not understand him and only ridiculed him. At first, he was offended at his friend for not offering the kind of support Vasia needed at a difficult time. But then he decided that his friend was right. He invents his own problems on the level playing field after all. Cheating on Olga was never out of the question. She only shared a story from the life of his girlfriend, and already Vasily thought of everything else. The man began to notice that his wife suddenly liked to drive a car. At first she fought back, saying that she needed the license to dust on the shelf, and then suddenly she had a taste for it. He laughed about it behind her back, but never said anything to Ollie's face. Listen, who rides with you all the time? He asked me once when they were in the car together. He was annoyed. But can't you throw out the trash behind you? He continued. Oh yes, it's Masha. She is so stressed right now. I'm not going to scold her because of the trash. My wife tried to calm down the conflict. Then throw it away yourself. Take over the car and keep an eye on it. Olga soothingly stroked her husband on the shoulder. In his mind, Vasily smiled at this gesture. He loved his wife and could not stay mad at her for long. To hell with them with these coffee cups and sugar wrappers. He would throw them away himself. One day, Vasily returned from work and found that they had the very same Masha who was in the middle of divorce. The woman did not look sad or even remotely upset. Vasia was sincerely happy for her. So it is not as bad as he thought. Maria greeted him cheerfully with a hug and a pat on the back. They exchanged a couple of duty phrases and the man began to heat up his dinner. Olga was smoking on the balcony. He did not disturb her. His wife's friend got up, poured herself a coffee and took a sip with pleasure. Why don't you add sugar? It must be bitter. Let's go home. Vasia reached for the sugar bowl. Yuck. The woman grimaced. Coffee with sugar is horrible crap. Vasily turned around and looked at Masha in surprise. Didn't she leave a pile of hidden sugar packets behind in the car? That's what Olga had said. The man decided to go in from afar and ask a question as if casually. Do you see Olga often? Marita shook her head in the negative, explaining that she didn't have time to see anyone. She had a lot of work to do. The quarterly report is coming up. We are all on the phone with Olia. Vasily automatically nodded and continued to fumble with dinner. Thoughts swarmed in his head. Who did the wrappers in the car and the empty coffee cups belong to then? Why did my wife say her friend was leaving them behind? There was no doubt in his mind that Masha was not lying. The question was elementary and required no lies. He spent the whole evening in his thoughts, and even at night he studied from side to side, unable to stop thinking. Finally, the decision came. Vasily decided to buy a listening device and plant it in his car. He immediately went online to choose the right one and with more or less peace of mind went to bed. The day X came, Vasia had the device in his hands. He sorted out the manual, set up the call recording function and put the beacon in the car under the seat. All that was left was to wait for Olga to take the car and give the unknown man a ride in it. He did not have to wait long. A couple of days later, his wife warned him that she would take the car to go with Masha on her affairs relating to the divorce. Vasily smiled, trying to hide his gloat. He knew that with the probability of 99% no, Masha wife will not take all day. Vasily spent like on needles. He could not wait to get into the car, get the tracker and listen to what he had managed to record. When he returned from work, Olga was already at home. Vasia told her he had prepared a speech about how he had to visit his friend and ran out of the house at once. His heart was racing as he approached the car. What was he going to hear now? Would it divide his whole life into before and after? For now he could only guess. He plugged his headphones into the recorder, pressed the play button. His palms were sweating, but Vasia himself was shaking like a cold. He had to rewind the tape several times until he finally heard a clap, a door, and a man's voice. Vasil's heart sank in his heels. Could it be that all of his worst thoughts were coming true right now? Olga and the stranger were talking about something. Vasia was not thinking clearly, and he could barely understand what they were saying. He fast-forwarded forward a little more. The engine of the car on the recording could no longer be heard, but there was a distinctive creaking and groaning sound. It was his wife's moaning. The man pulled the earphones out of his ears sharply. He couldn't catch his breath, as if he had run 100 meters. He suddenly realized that he was sitting gripped in the steering wheel, rushing somewhere with his crazy eyes. He didn't look so good. Pulling was not an option. Vasily decided that he had to tear up sharply, like a band-aid in his hands. With the recorder, he went back up to the apartment. Olga was surprised by his arrival.